Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Catalyst. My name is JR. I'm the teaching pastor here. And I want to tell you about a time when I stole my own car. I was 17 years old. I had the sweetest first car. It was a 1981 Chevy Caprice Classic. It was a giant boat of a car that could not go more than 70 miles an hour, even downhill. It was two-tone brown, so it was real cool when I was driving it around town. And when I was 17, I got grounded. I don't remember what I did, but I'm sure it was a legitimate grounding. And I was grounded from driving my car. That was the punishment. I was not allowed to drive my car. So which meant I had to ride the bus to school. And 17-year-old me did not think that this was an acceptable agreement. So I waited until my mom left for work the morning of school, and I took my car, even though I was expressly told not to. And as you can imagine, my mom was furious at me, because I had taken her car, even though I was expressly told not to. Now, obviously, my mom was in the right. I was living in her house. I was still under her rules. And when she said no car, that should have been the end of it. But I disagreed with her. I was in fact blinded by my own sense of entitlement, my own sense of privilege. I did not see this car as a gift that my mom had given me. Right? That came, that again, the reason she gave me the car was because she was trying to help me as her child grow into a flourishing, productive part of the community, right? And the car was a part of that. It wasn't just like I got the car because I turned 16 and that was what I do, right? The car was an intentional gift by my mom to help me learn responsibility and learn how to flourish. And when I wasn't doing those things, she took the car away as a punishment. And I couldn't see that. I thought that I was entitled to the car. I thought I deserved the car. And so when she tried to take it away from me, I stole it and then faced even worse consequences after that. So today I want to talk about the ways in which we too might be blinded to the work of God in our own lives. I want to talk about how the things that God has given us to help us live into the life that He created us for and calls us to can sometimes actually blind us to the work that God is doing in our lives. I want to talk about how we feel sometimes a sense of entitlement and a sense of privilege, and how that gets in the way of what God wants to do in our lives. And then I want to talk about the lengths that God will go to as a loving parent to discipline us and to call us out of those things and try to rescue us and to have life. So everything that we're going to be talking about today is grounded in God's love for us and grounded in God's desire to see us flourish and to see us live into the lives that He created us for and calls us to. So we're going to begin by singing together and celebrating this God who loves us, this God who calls us, and this God without whom we do not have life. If you're a guest with us, I just want to say thank you for being with us. For the next hour or so that we're together, the only thing that we ask of you is that you be open to hear from God, because we believe that God has called us all here together and that God is speaking to us. And if we will be open to hear from God, God will hear from God. So that's all we ask of you as a guest, is just that you be open to hear from God. So please stand and sing with us as we begin worshiping this morning.
Wandering in a desert, every fountain, a mirage that fades to sand. Where have you gone? I am lost, running around in circles. Every hope, another broken promise, just between my fingers. Where have you gone? Quench the thirst within my soul. Fill my hands to overflow. to you. I am chosen, called out of my slumber, endless fountain, bringing life to all they find. I am made new. Won't you wash, 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 wash away our sorrow? For I know, Lord, you are the water to flood us with your mercy. We are made new. Bring us back to you. Bring us back to you. Quench the thirst within our soul. Fill our hands to overflow. You are all we want and need, more than every breath we breathe. So bring us back to you. We feel pain down and over. impossible and holy. Kings become fools for you, kingdoms to ruins for you. Vapor find ground in you, music finds sound in you. Everything rising, everything rising, everything rising, everything rising, everything rising. Sing. Come like dawn, like wave, like sunlight, bring this world to life. Come like rain, like breath, like springtime, bring this world to Let's pray together. Father, we thank you. This morning, Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to lean into your presence, Father, through song and through our personal meditation and reflection. Father, we know that distractions happen in life, pain happens in life. Lord, and we want to be honest about those distractions, be honest about those difficulties, recognize where they're coming from, and know that you love us through it. Lord, we ask that you'd open our hearts and our minds as we've committed to doing this morning, Lord, to listen to what you have for us. Lord, change us, speak to us. We love you. We thank you for loving us. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
You can have a seat. As we are continuing to worship, I wanted to take just a moment to call your attention to this little guy we call the Beaker Mini. There's a bunch of info in here, so if you didn't get one on the way in, grab one on your way out. I wanted to first say thank you to all of you who contributed canned goods to the food drive that we did for Life Message. Today was the last day to bring all of that stuff, and that's all going to go to Life Message for the Thanksgiving holiday so that they can provide food to some families that need a little bit of extra help. So thank you again to all of you who did that. And because Christmas is right around the corner, we have another opportunity to help out. We do something every year called Project Reindeer. It used to be called Rowlett Reindeer, but we've expanded outside of just the city of Rowlett, so now it's just Project Reindeer. And so we have some little angels that have a kid's name on them, and this kid is part of a family that is not going to be able to do presents for Christmas this year. And so if you want to take one of those when you leave today, and you have to sign it out so we know who took the kid's name in case you forget or lose track or something like that, we can, remind you gently and firmly to get those here. And so, we want to make sure that you can, that you have a chance to get those gifts. They're due back here by December 3rd, which is 2 Sundays from now. And I know that's super early, even though most of you have your Christmas trees up already, right? I know that. So it is super early so that they have a chance to get the presents wrapped and to be able to get them to the kids by Christmas. So we need them back by December 3rd. So if you want to participate in that, you can sign up for one of those and take one of those with you on the way out, and we need them back in 2 Sundays. Also in 2 Sundays, in the evening, we're doing something that we've really never done here at Catalyst, at least not as long as I've been here, which is a sort of bonus thing to what we're doing in the sermons on Sunday mornings. We're coming towards the end of this series that we've been doing on lament, and we've been focusing on individual lament and how we recover from individual trauma and stuff like that. But throughout the series, we've been in the book of Lamentations, which, as you know, if you've been here, is a corporate book. It's about a corporate tragedy, a corporate loss. And so the book of Lamentations actually shapes us to work through things that affect all of us together, not just things that we suffer on our own. And so in light of that, on the evening of December 3rd, we're going to come together and we're going to talk about race in America. And we're going to do that by using a lot of the skills and the tools that we've been learning throughout the book of Lamentations. And we're going to see how by lamenting our racial history in this country, we can actually, as a church, come together and be a holy voice in the conversation about race in our country, be a site of healing and hope rather than just continuing divisiveness and pain. And so I really hope that you make it a point to be here for that. It's at 6 p.m. We're going to have several of our own congregation leading us in that in kind of a panel conversation. We're also bringing a couple of friends from outside the church to participate in that as well. So I hope you can be here and be a part of that on December 3rd as well. Also in here, there is a little next step card, and one of the things on there is a spot that says, I need prayers for, and then some blanks. If there is something that is going on in your life that we could join you in prayer over, please write it down on there. We would love, and you can drop it in the box by the door on the way out. We'll send it out to our church family so that we can be praying with you. We would love to pray with you about whatever is going on there. And if it is something that is more confidential, and you mark the box that says this is confidential, then only our pastoral team will see that so that our pastors can be praying with you, okay? We like to tear this off all at the same time because we like the sound it makes. So if you get it ready, I'm going to count to 3, nice and slow, in case you have it put away. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Very good. And kids, that means it's time for you to head back to the lab. Thank you for being in here with us and singing with us. They're going to go back and hear the good news about Jesus in language that is right at their level. So thank you, Dina. Thank you to your lab team. And we'll see you afterwards. Thank you for singing with us. As they leave, I want to invite you to pass peace with me. This is something that we do every week here at Catalyst. As we know that peace comes into the world from God, but it comes through us. God anoints us as peacemakers and sends us into the world to make peace, to create peace where there is strife. And so each week we greet each other and we offer each other peace as a way of remembering that we go back into the world with a mission from God to make peace. So as we continue to worship, would you please stand and greet some people around you and offer them peace in the name of Jesus.
Where the road is dark and the seed is sown.
Our series right now is called Good Grief. We have a couple of weeks left in it. And this series is about the process of lament. Lament is a process that we enter into, or that we can enter into, in times of trauma and tragedy. And it's based on the ideas by theologian Walter Brueggemann, who introduces us to what he calls the cycle of lament, or the process of lamentation. And that process looks like this. In our lives, we are in a state of what he calls orientation, which essentially just means that, we're going about our business, right? We have a way that we see the world. We have a way we expect things to be. We have a way we expect to experience things. We're oriented in the world in a certain way. And then tragedy strikes, trauma hits, something happens that upends our world, and it feels like all of our foundations have crumbled away, and it feels like we don't know what to do. That could be the loss of an important relationship, the death of someone close to us. It could be like the loss of a job or the loss of something that's really foundational to our identity. But something happens, some kind of tragedy, that makes us feel insecure, or it makes us feel out of control, or it makes us feel worthless, right? It hits us at this deep core level, and it kind of upends our lives, and we're disoriented. And oftentimes, when we are disoriented, our tendency is to want to try to get back to the way things were when we felt safe and secure, right, and in control. We want to get back to that place of orientation. But the reality is we can't do that. Like there's no way to go back to the way things were. And so if that's all we try to do, we end up in kind of this vicious cycle where we end up with a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, not just for ourselves, but for the other people in our lives. And so what Walter Brueggemann invites us to do is to look to the scriptures and see that there is a process in the scriptures called lament that actually helps us move through that experience of disorientation to a place of reorientation. And as we begin to be reoriented, we have a new, more mature, deeper understanding of the world, of our place in the world, of God and our relationship to God, of other people and our relationships with other people, and we end up in a more stable place. But we cannot get to reorientation unless we go through the process of lamenting. Lamenting is what helps us get there. It's what keeps us from being stuck in that sort of disorientation place. And so throughout this series, we've been in the book of Lamentations, because the book of Lamentations is our invitation to look at what this process of lament looks like. So go ahead, if you have a Bible, and turn with me to Lamentations chapter 4, because we're going to be in chapter 4 today. If you grabbed one of the free Bibles out of the back, this is on page 489. And if you don't own a Bible, please keep that one. Consider a gift from us. As you are turning or clicking over to Lamentations 4, to review if you have been here and if you have not been here, to catch you up, the book of Lamentations is a series of 5 poems that were composed by the prophet Jeremiah in the wake of an event that historians and scholars call the exile. God's people were living in the nation of Judah, and they were, again, just like every nation, looking for safety and security, looking for a place in the nations around them. And the Babylonian Empire was the dominant world power at the time. That's modern-day Iraq, right? And the Babylonian Empire was just gobbling up nations and getting closer and closer and closer and closer to God's people, to the nation of Judah. So as the Babylonian Empire got closer and closer, as their armies just proved to be unstoppable, and as they were swallowing up nation after nation, God was continually telling the people, keep your faith in me, trust in me, and I will keep you safe, even from the Babylonians. Even the mighty Babylonians are no match for the power of Yahweh. But the people didn't listen to God's prophets. They didn't trust in God. And so they began to make these alliances with all of these other nations. They thought maybe if we all band together, we can protect ourselves, right? And what happened when the Babylonians arrived on their doorstep was that many of those nations either abandoned them or in some cases even betrayed them to the Babylonians. And it turned out that God's prophets were right. And the Babylonians completely destroyed the nation of Judah. They devastated the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed God's holy temple. And they took all of the cultural leaders away and away into exile. That's why we call it the exile. They took them to Babylon. And they left the people of Jerusalem leaderless, defenseless, and completely devastated. And that is the situation into which the book of Lamentations speaks. They were disoriented. All of the things that made them feel safe and secure, their political leaders, their temple with all of their priests, even their the basic family structures of the society had all been torn away. And they were left completely disoriented. And the book of Lamentations is our guide to how the prophet Jeremiah was helping them to be reoriented in the world. So it's 5 poems. And we've been working our way through one chapter at a time through each of the 5 poems. Today's the 4th one. In the first poem, we saw the prophet and the woman who is the embodiment of the people of the city, right? And we saw in that first poem that so often our tendency in times of trauma is to want to offer answers, right? To speak to people, to tell them, tell them things like God's in control or something like that. But actually what we need to do is just sit with them, be with them in their trauma. That what people need in times of grief is not answers, but a holy presence, a loving presence. That was chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we looked at what it means to take stock of our own part in this. The people of Jerusalem had a part to play in their own devastation. They refused to listen to God. And we saw that oftentimes, because God is a loving parent and because God will discipline us, God disciplines us by giving us what we think we want and letting us face the consequences of that. And that's what we saw in Lamentations 2, which talked about the anger of God. And this is how God gets angry at us, right? We're going to kind of circle back and go through some of that stuff again today as we look more at what God's discipline in our lives look like. But in chapter 2, we saw that sometimes in our grief, we need to take serious stock of our own lives and ask how I contributed to the situation that I'm in. And then last week in Lamentations chapter 3, we saw that the woman and the prophet, rather than standing aside, rather than pointing a finger, rather than accusing and saying, I told you so, he joins the woman in her grief. And he grieves with her. And so we saw this movement towards solidarity, where it quit being the woman and the prophet, and it just became a kind of a we, right? Because he so fully entered into her pain. And we're going to see that again in Lamentations 4 today. There's no longer these 2 characters kind of talking back and forth. It's all just the people of the city speaking together and giving voice to their pain. And what we're going to see today in Lamentations chapter 4 is the things that the people of Jerusalem had looked to for life, the things that they had looked to give them a sense of value, to make them feel secure, to make them feel like they were in control. And again, these are all the things that have been stripped away from them in this event. So this is Lamentations chapter 4. I'm going to begin in verse 1 and kind of just read through. I'm going to skip through a little bit, but the prophet says, "How the gold has lost its luster. Even the finest gold has become dull. The sacred gemstones lie scattered in the streets. See how the precious children of Jerusalem, worth their weight in fine gold, are now treated like pots of clay made by a common potter. Even the jackals feed their young, but not my people Israel. They ignore their children's cries like ostriches in the deserts. The parched tongues of the little ones stick to the roofs of their mouth in thirst. The children cry for bread, but no one has any to give them. The people who once ate the richest foods now beg in the streets for anything they can get. Those who once wore the finest clothes now search the garbage dumps for food. The guilt of my people is greater than that of Sodom, where utter disaster struck in a moment, and no hand offered help. Our princes once glowed with health, brighter than the snow, whiter than milk. Their faces were as ruddy as rubies, their appearance like the jewels. But now their faces are blacker than soot. No one recognizes them in the streets. Their skin sticks to their bones, and it is hard and dry as wood. Those killed by the sword are better off than those that die of hunger. Starving, they waste away for lack of food from the fields. Tender-hearted women have cooked their own children. They have eaten them to survive the siege. But now the anger of the Lord is satisfied. His fierce anger has been poured out. He started a fire in Jerusalem that burned the city to its foundations. Not a king in all the earth, no one in all the world would have believed that an enemy could march through the gates of Jerusalem. Yet it happened because of the sins of her prophets and the sins of her priests, who defiled the city by shedding innocent blood. They wandered blindly through the streets, so defiled by blood that no one dared touch them. Get away, the people shouted at them. You're defiled, don't touch us. So they fled the distant lands and wandered among the foreign nations, but no one would let them stay. The Lord himself has scattered them, and he no longer helps them. People show no respect for the priests and no longer honor the leaders. We looked in vain for our allies to come and save us, but we were looking to nations that could not help us. Wow. This is really a confession that we're seeing here, a confession by God's people. They made this giant list of all of the places that they had looked for safety, for comfort, for security, for value and worth. They looked to money, and they said, now the gold is worthless. They had looked to children. And in the ancient world, much as today, right? Children are about the legacy that they're able to leave. They're how you live on. They're how you pass on the things that you inherited from your parents and the things that you value, right? And how you pass on to your children. And those have been stripped away in this. They look to pleasure. They look to luxury. And they said even the people with the finest robes are now looking in the garbage for food. Even the people who lived in the lap of luxury have nothing. They looked to their kings, their political rulers. They had nothing to offer them. They looked to their religious leaders, and they said even the most religious people now are defiled, and no one wants anything to do with them. Every aspect of Israelite society, everything that people had looked to give them a sense of value, to give them a sense of identity, has been stripped away from them, and they're left with nothing. And I think we struggle even as we read that, we kind of recoil. Right? We struggle to understand how this could be good news, how this could be the act of a loving God. If you were here when we explored chapter 2, if you weren't, I really encourage you to go back and get that message. But we talked about how oftentimes God's anger is when God gives us what we want, when God turns us over to the things that we desire more than him, so that we can face the full consequences of that. And that's what we're seeing here. In this passage, we're seeing all of the things that people had put their trust in, had put their hope in, that they had put their faith in, stripped away. And now they're left only to face God. These are the things that had distracted them from God. I want to share with you a quote from Thomas Merton. He was a Trappist monk. He actually lived in Lexington, Kentucky, so he was a good old Southern boy. And Merton is one of the most important religious figures of the 20th century. He's up there with like Billy Graham and Mother Teresa and all of those. Okay, his writings have been profoundly influential on a couple of generations now of theologians. And I want to share with you, this is from his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. And it's a pretty lengthy quote, but I wanted to put this part up here and then read the rest of it with you. Merton says, every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. This is the man that I want myself to be, but who cannot exist because God does not know anything about him. And to be unknown by God is altogether too much privacy. My false and private self is the one who wants to exist outside the reach of God's will and God's love, outside of reality and outside of life. And such a self cannot help but be an illusion. And we are not very good at recognizing illusions, least of all the ones that we cherish about ourselves, the ones we are born with, and the one that feeds the roots of sin. For most people in the world, there is no greater subjective reality than this false self of theirs, which cannot exist. A life devoted to the cult of this shadow is what is called a life of sin. All sin starts from the assumption that my false self, the self that exists only in my own egocentric desires, is the fundamental reality of life to which everything else in the universe is ordered. Thus, I use up my life in the desire for pleasure, in the thirst for experience, for power, for honor, for knowledge and love, to clothe this false self and construct its nothingness into something objectively real. And I wind experiences around myself and cover myself with pleasures and glory like bandages in order to make myself perceptible to myself and to the world, as if I were an invisible body that could only become visible when something visible covered its surface. But there is no substance under these things with which I am clothed. I am hollow, and my structures of pleasures and ambitions has no foundation. I am objectified in them. They are all destined by their very contingency to be destroyed. And when they are gone, there will be nothing left of me but my own nakedness and emptiness and hollowness to tell me that I am my own mistake. Yeah, let's sit with that for a second. Right? Merton warns us that each of us has this false self, this shadow self that we create and that we put up into the world. And then we wrap this shadow self with all these things in our world. We actually take the blessings of God, the good things that God has given us, and we then try to wrap them around our false self, like we're that invisible man, right? That has to have bandages around himself so that he can go out in the world. That's how our shadow self is. So let's just kind of run through those things that the Israelites had stripped away from them, because we do that too, right? Our self-worth, our identity, is not found in the size of our paychecks and how many rooms are in our house and the model of car that we drive. Because our value is not found in the value of the things we possess. Our way in the world is not charted out by the political party that we support, by the political leaders that we follow, or by the promises that they make to us. Because there is no human political leader that can accomplish God's mission in the world. Our lives are not made meaningful by our kids and their schedules, right? A full schedule is not the same thing as a full life. Our meaning is not found in having holy leaders in our churches that we look up to. It's not found in doing all of the right things and checking all of the right religious boxes, because religion and holiness are not the same thing. Our lives are not measured by how successful we are, by how well we stack up when we compare ourselves to our neighbors or to our Facebook friends or whoever else that we compare ourselves to. These things are all ways that we wrap ourselves up in these shadow selves, ways that we try to make ourselves valuable and worthwhile, ways that we try to exert control over our lives, ways that we try to make ourselves feel safe and secure. And the problem is that all of those things, though they are good things, are created things. They're contingent things, which is a way of saying that they owe their existence to their Creator, just like we do. Right? They would not exist apart from God. They're contingent. And because they're contingent, because they're created, they cannot bear the weight of our lives. When we build our lives on these things, they crumble, just like when your house has a bad foundation. Right? They make a poor foundation for us. They can't bear the weight of our lives. And Lamentations 4 shows us what happens when we put our trust in those things. God gives us over to them, like we saw in Lamentations 2. And then when that happens, these things are all stripped away. And the question becomes, for Israel, when all of these things were stripped away, all these things they put between themselves and God, all of these things that they wrapped themselves up in to make themselves feel safe, to feel like they were in control, what's left? What's underneath the bandages when you strip all of that away? It's worth asking yourself that question. Do a little thought experiment. What do I wrap my shadow self up in? What are the things that I put my worth and my value in? What makes me feel powerful and in control? What makes me feel safe? And if those things are stripped away, what's left? That's a scary question for a lot of us, I think. It's a scary question to ask, what's underneath all of that? And that's how you know that you've got a shadow self, when you're afraid to ask that question. Because you don't want your shadow self to be seen, right? Because it can't be. It's not real. That's not the real you. That's not the you that God created and calls and loves. That's our sinful self. I'm a pastor. Y'all probably knew that, right? And so for me, I fall into that like value and self-worth. That's where I get my sense of control, right? Is in feeling valuable and feeling worthwhile. And so being a pastor, there's always more things that I can do to make me feel like I'm doing a better job. Right? There's always another meeting I can have, or another visit I can make, or another, people that I can sit with and talk with, or have a meal with, or whatever. There's always more. My job is never done. Right? I'm sure you're the same way. Right? I don't think any of us have a job where we just, think, I just have all this free time and I wish I had more things to do. Like, I've met very few people that could say that, right? I was talking to several of you teachers who have the week off. I was like, what are you doing for your week off? And you're like, oh, I'm catching up on all the stuff I haven't done yet, right? Yeah. So I know that you know that feeling, right? That there's always a little more that you could be doing, that if you just worked a little harder, you'd feel a little more valuable, you'd feel a little more in control, you'd feel a little more safe, or whatever. That's the false promise of idols. Idols always say, hey, if you serve me, right? If you serve a busy schedule, if you serve politics, if you serve religion, if you serve success, you're going to feel good. You're going to feel what you want to feel. You're going to feel valuable. You're going to feel powerful. You're going to feel safe. And when you don't, they say, well, yeah, but that's because you just need to just do a little more. Right? And then you do a little more, and they're like, well, yeah, you just do a little more. You just do a little more. And so we just work and work and work and do and give our lives to these things, and they keep moving the finish line. Right? Because you never actually feel safe and secure and powerful and valuable, and that's because the idols can't actually give you those things. That's why it's wrong to take the good things that God has given us and build our lives on them. And Lamentation shows us the consequences of that those things will be stripped away and we'll be left with whatever we have, which, again, if we spend our lives giving them to idols, is not much. One of my favorite authors and pastors is this guy named Ian Cron. And I heard him speak recently, and he was kind of riffing on this Merton quote. And he said that the answer to this, the way we find freedom from idolatry, is by allowing ourselves to be seen by God. Because God doesn't see our shadow selves. It doesn't matter what we wrap our shadow selves up in or how much we wrap them up. God doesn't see it because God didn't create that. We created that. What God sees is our true selves, the selves that God created and calls and loves. That's who God sees. And so the solution to finding freedom from idolatry, he said, is to sit in the beholding gaze of God. He said, because when God looks at us, God doesn't just look at us, God beholds us. And he said, think of the way a mother looks at her newborn child. right? She's just staring at the baby. She's not like looking for something, right? She's just completely captivated by the beauty of this child. And the child is not really sure what's going on, right? The child doesn't know even what like nose and eyes are, really, right? The child only knows that there is something beautiful and good happening. And as much as it is able to understand whatever the world that it has just been thrust into is at this point, it knows that there is this good, benevolent presence that is beholding it, loving it, completely and totally, without the kid having done anything, right? The kid is not a productive member of society at this point, right? Has contributed nothing to the good of the world and the flourishing of people. It just has, been born. And in that moment, before the child has done anything, it is loved completely and wholly, and it is beheld by the mother's loving gaze. And this is how God beholds us. Without any of the stuff that we try to wrap our false selves in, God just sees us as we are and loves us. So we can choose to allow God to see us. But that is painful. It's scary because the shadow self doesn't like that. The shadow self convinces us that we have to do more, be more, try harder in order to be seen, right? You just need to wrap yourselves up a little more. And God's beholding gaze strips all of that away and says, no, it actually doesn't matter. None of that matters, right? I just see you. And so when we sit in God's beholding gaze, we feel the shadow self begin to kick and squirm and fight and hate and distract, because the shadow self doesn't want to be seen. It certainly doesn't want our true selves to be seen, because then we might realize that we don't need this life of sin. We don't need these idols and their false promises. We only need God. And so we can choose to enter into this thing in Lamentations 4 where all of this stuff is stripped away. Right? We can choose to do that, which is such a beautiful thing. We can choose to lose these things before they are taken from us. We can choose to lose these things before we find out that putting our trust in them ends badly. We know it's going to end badly. We know that idols never fulfill their promises. And so we can choose by entering into this relationship with God, by choosing to sit in God's gaze and allow ourselves to be beheld by God, we can choose to be there. And this is how we find reorientation through the process of lament. When we find freedom from our false selves. When we find that all of the things that we have put in our lives to make us feel valuable, to make us feel safe, to make us feel like we're in control, when we find that those things don't actually give us what we want from them, and that those things only come from God, and we find this new freedom to enter back into all of that, right? This is not saying like you should never talk about politics or never, vote. It's not saying you shouldn't be a part of a church community. It's not saying you should give your kids up for adoption or something like none of that. Obviously not saying any of that. We're saying that all of these things are good blessings from God. It is a blessing to be a part of a political system where we can participate and our voice matters. It is a blessing to be a part of a church community where we find fellowship and friendship together as we grow in faith. It is a blessing to be a part of a family. It is a blessing to be in relationships with people. These things are blessings. But when we build our lives on them, they become idols that can destroy us. And so by sitting in God's beholding gaze, by allowing the creator of our lives to see us and to reveal even to us our true selves, the shadow self dies, and we find this new freedom to go into all of those places, to be a parent because we want to be a parent, not because we need meaning and purpose from that, right? To participate in politics because we want to be in politics, not because, we are finding meaning and purpose and promise in that. To be a part of a church community because we are free to, not because we're looking for some kind of quick fix, right? To be in relationships with other people out of a sense of generosity and encouragement, not because we need affirmation, validation, or something like that. Being in God's beholding gaze frees us. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how to do that at the end today. But before we do anything else, I want to invite you to the communion table. Because this table invites us to share the meal that Jesus shared with his followers the night before he was killed. At that meal, when he broke bread and passed it to them as his body, he said, "Take and eat, this is my body, it's broken for you." When he passed a cup of wine and he said, "This is my blood, it's poured out as a new covenant between you and God. It's for the forgiveness of sin." To come to this table is to be beheld by God. It's to see the consequences of living in our false selves. And it's to allow God to see us, to embrace us. And so you don't have to be a member of Catalyst to receive communion with us today. If you are willing to say no to your false self, if you are willing to stop believing the lies, the things that our culture idolizes, promises us, then you're welcome to come forward. If you are willing to allow God to behold you, to see you, then you're welcome to come to the table today. Before you come, I'm going to lead us in a prayer of examen. I'm going to ask you 4 questions and give you some space to reflect prayerfully on them. And the examen is an opportunity for you to consider with God how you are responding to today's message. After I've asked you those 4 questions, I'm going to pray for us. Then as you're ready, you're welcome to come forward. So here's the first question I want you to consider. When in the last week did I sit in God's loving gaze? That might sound weird to some of you, right? But consider, was there a time when you just weren't trying to do or earn anything and you just allowed yourself to be loved by God? How in the last week did I try to make my shadow self-visible? What was your poison? What's the way that you try to wrap yourself up? Especially since we're going into Thanksgiving week, it's going to be a weird week. There's going to be probably some extra triggers that are not usually there, especially if you're, hanging out with family or something like that. So, how in the next week will I try to make my shadow self visible? What are some ways that you're going to be probably looking for affirmation or control or security? What are the places that are going to make you feel unvaluable or unsafe or out of control? And finally, how can I choose to be seen by God this week? I'm going to give you a practice you can try here at the end, but for now, maybe just think about what are some spaces you can create where you can just sit and allow God to behold you. What's that going to look like? Again, I know it's a crazy week with Thanksgiving. God, we confess this morning as we have been gathered by your Spirit to worship that we are a people who too often lives in our shadow selves. We feel unsafe, or we feel a lack of control, or we feel a sense of worthlessness, and so we surround ourselves with so many things so that we feel valuable, so that we feel worthwhile, so that we feel powerful, so that we feel safe. And we have seen this morning in the story of your people Israel what happens when we pursue idolatry. What happens when it's revealed that our shadow selves are in fact shadows. Many of us have experienced firsthand the pain of having those things stripped away from us. And so we come to your table this morning at your invitation. An invitation that is not based on how hard we've worked or how much we've accomplished or anything like that. It's based purely on the fact that you created us and that you love us. And so we come this morning to your table to be seen by you, truly and wholly. We come this morning to strip away all of those things that we have tried to wrap ourselves up in, to make ourselves visible to the world, because we are already visible to you and we have always been visible to you. And so we ask that these wafers and juice become a spiritual food for us. We ask that you would give us the grace that we need to cast off our idols, to say no to our shadow selves. And we ask that in doing so, we might find the life that you created us for and that you called us to. We ask that you would send us away from this table into your world as your people, living in our true selves, finding our sense of worth, our sense of security, our sense of power from you, that we might then imitate you in the world. We offer these prayers and we approach your table this morning in the name of your Son, Jesus.
Right, you're welcome to join us as we sing this one last song together.
A couple of things before you go. First of all, I want to thank you, as always, those of you who are regularly supporting Catalyst through serving and through giving financially. We are able to do what we do because of your faithfulness, so thank you for that. Also, in light of that, I'd like to invite our youth pastor, Tommy Cash, to come up for just a moment. We did not get a chance to properly recognize him on Pastor Appreciation Sunday, and so I wanted to embarrass him now, well and proper, in front of all of you. If you have a teen or if you work with teens, you know how much Tommy does to serve our teens and how grateful we are for him. If you don't, let me just tell you that he works harder than probably anyone I've ever met, and I'm so grateful for the wisdom that he shares with the teens, the amount of work, the amount of creativity, the amount of love that he shares with them and with his leadership. He really is doing his best to build a whole team there. So, Tommy, we just want to say, as your church, we're really grateful for your service, and we want to say thank you and we love you. Also, again, if you're a guest, I just want to say thank you for being with us. We know it can be tricky to get connected to a new church, and we made an experience called the Newcomers Lunch to make it really easy to do that. The next one is on December 10th. It's right after our second gathering. It's about 45 minutes long, and at that time we feed you, and we tell you who Catalyst is and what God is doing here, and we help you figure out what your next step is to get connected to the church. So at the top of this next step card that we have, there's a box that says you want to come to Newcomers Lunch. You can check that and drop it in the box by the door on your way out, and we'll get you signed up. As you're going, I told you I'd give you a practice that would help you kind of get your head around what it means to be beheld by God. That practice is the practice of Christian meditation. There is a difference between Christian meditation and Eastern meditation, like